Records discovered in a forgotten courthouse vault in Richmond, Virginia, during renovations in 1932, revealed something that disturbed local historians so profoundly that the documents were quietly resealed and marked as administratively insignificant. Between 1847 and 1851, plantation owners across 7 counties in central Virginia reported the same impossible occurrence. Slave children, some as young as 6 years old, were being caught with written notes, crude journals, and in one case, a complete handwritten copy of passages from a book no slave should have even touched. 63 separate incidents were documented in the first year alone. Each child, when questioned separately and sometimes months apart, offered the same cryptic response about the night teacher. Every investigation led to dead ends. Every trail went cold. Authorities at the time concluded their reports with variations of the same phrase. Source unidentified. Threat level severe. What those plantation owners feared wasn't just literacy. It was the realization that someone had been moving through their properties for years, completely unseen, teaching what was forbidden under penalty of death. This person knew their routines, their blind spots, their vulnerabilities. He moved like smoke through their lands, and despite patrols, dogs, and increasingly desperate surveillance efforts, he remained invisible. The psychological impact on the planter class was profound. If their control was so absolute, how had this happened under their noses? If one man could do this, what else was happening that they couldn't see? Before we continue with the story of the man who became Virginia's most wanted ghost, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And leave a comment below telling us what state or city you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. What makes this case particularly chilling is that it wasn't discovered through careful investigation or confession, but through the careless confidence of children who didn't yet understand the danger they were in. And when the truth finally emerged, it revealed a network of secret education so sophisticated and widespread that it challenged everything the plantation system believed about itself. Cumberland County, Virginia, in the autumn of 1847, was a landscape of contradictions. Rolling hills covered in tobacco fields stretched toward the James River, and the county roads connected over 40 plantations of varying sizes, from sprawling estates with hundreds of enslaved workers to modest farms with a dozen. The soil was rich, the harvests were profitable, and the social order was considered by those who benefited from it to be unshakable. The county had weathered Nat Turner's rebellion 16 years earlier without local incident, and the planter class had emerged with their confidence reinforced. They had tightened their controls, improved their surveillance, and convinced themselves that their system was perfected. The landscape itself conspired to create a false sense of security. The plantations were connected by a network of roads, some well-maintained and heavily traveled, others barely more than cart paths through the woods. Between the cultivated fields lay stretches of forest, oak, pine, and hickory, that had been left largely untouched because the land was too rocky or poorly drained for agriculture. These woods created natural boundaries between properties, and while the planters knew them well enough to hunt in, they rarely patrolled them systematically. The forests were considered empty spaces, useful only as timber resources and hunting grounds. The James River curved through the eastern part of the county, providing transportation for goods and people. Flatboats and barges moved tobacco down to Richmond and returned with supplies. Along the riverbanks stood old mills, some still operational, others abandoned when their owners died or moved west. These structures dotted the landscape like forgotten monuments, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. The Carver plantation sat along the northern boundary of the county, a mid-sized operation with 73 enslaved people and a reputation for being what the owner, Thomas Carver, called well-regulated. Carver was a third-generation tobacco planter, a man who prided himself on his extensive library and his membership in the Virginia Agricultural Society. He kept meticulous records of everything: crop yields, weather patterns, births and deaths among the enslaved population, expenses and profits. His ledgers were works of art, filled with neat columns and detailed annotations. He read agricultural journals, corresponded with other planters about best practices, and attended regional meetings where men discussed soil composition and pest control with the seriousness of scholars. Carver's library was his sanctuary, a room lined floor to ceiling with books on agriculture, history, philosophy, and religion. He spent his evenings there, reading by lamplight, making notes in the margins of his volumes. He considered himself an educated man, a thinking man, someone who understood the world through the lens of reason and order. His worldview was built on the certainty that society functioned according to natural laws, and that these laws placed different people in different positions for logical, even divine reasons. His wife, Elizabeth Carver, managed the household with quiet efficiency. She oversaw the domestic workers, planned meals, entertained guests, and maintained the social connections that were essential to the family's standing in the community. She was involved in the local church, organized charitable activities for poor white families, and believed sincerely that she was a benevolent force in the lives of those who worked in her home. Among the enslaved people on the Carver plantation was a girl named Ruth, 8 years old, who worked in the main house under the supervision of the head housekeeper, a woman named Dinah. Ruth had been born on the plantation, the daughter of a field worker named Sarah, and a father she had never known, sold away before she was born. Ruth was small for her age, quiet and observant. She had learned early to move through spaces without drawing attention, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to read the moods of the white family with the precision necessary for survival. Ruth worked from dawn until well after dark. She swept floors, carried water, polished silver, and helped in the kitchen. She slept in a small room off the kitchen with 3 other girls, and her entire world consisted of the main house, the yard, and the brief moments of freedom she found in the early morning before her work began, or late at night after the family had retired. She had never been to school. The concept of school, as something that existed for children, was foreign to her. She knew that the Carver children, 2 boys ages 10 and 12, studied with a tutor who came twice a week, and she had glimpsed them sitting at desks, bent over books, writing on slates. But that world was as distant from her as the moon. Until the night, everything changed. It was late summer 1846, more than a year before Ruth's discovery would set everything in motion. The tobacco harvest was approaching, and the atmosphere on the plantation was tense with anticipation and exhaustion. Everyone worked longer hours, and by nightfall, most people collapsed into sleep. Ruth had been sent to the spring house to fetch butter for the morning's breakfast preparation. The spring house was a small stone structure built over a cold stream, located about 100 yards from the main house, at the edge of the woods. It was dusk, the sky fading from orange to deep purple, and Ruth carried a tin lantern that cast nervous shadows on the path. She retrieved the butter and was walking back when she noticed something odd. Near the old tobacco barn, a structure that hadn't been used for storage in years and stood partially hidden by overgrown weeds, there was a faint light, barely visible through the gaps in the wooden walls. Ruth stopped walking. She knew she should return to the house immediately. Curiosity was dangerous. But something about that light drew her forward. She set down her lantern and moved quietly through the tall grass toward the barn. As she approached, she heard a voice. Not loud, but clear and calm. A man's voice. "This is the letter A. It makes the sound you hear at the beginning of apple. Can you say it with me?" Ruth crept closer and peered through a gap in the barn wall. Inside, illuminated by a small shielded lantern, she saw a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark skin and graying hair, wearing simple work clothes. In front of him sat 3 children. 2 boys and a girl all around her age. They were sitting on the dirt floor, staring intently at something the man was drawing in the dust with a stick. "A," the children repeated. "Good," the man said. "Now watch how I write it." He drew the letter carefully, explaining each stroke. Then he handed the stick to one of the boys. "Your turn." Ruth watched, transfixed, as the boy traced the letter in the dirt, his tongue sticking out in concentration. The man praised him, corrected his grip on the stick, and had him try again. Ruth didn't know how long she stood there, but eventually the man straightened and looked directly at the gap where she was watching. She froze, her heart hammering. "You can come in if you want," he said gently, "but you have to be very quiet." Ruth hesitated, then slowly pushed open the barn door and stepped inside. The 3 children looked at her with wide eyes, but the man smiled. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ruth," she whispered. "I'm Jacob," he said. "Do you want to learn?" Ruth nodded, unable to speak. Jacob gestured to a space on the floor. "Sit down. We just started." That night, Ruth learned the letter A. Jacob showed her how to form it, how to recognize it, how to sound it out. He was patient and encouraging, never rushing, never scolding. When the lesson ended, perhaps only 30 minutes later, Jacob carefully erased all the letters from the dirt floor and told the children to go home. "Don't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice serious. "Not your parents, not your friends, not anyone. This is our secret. Do you understand?" They all nodded. "If anyone finds out, I'll have to leave, and you won't be able to learn anymore. So you have to be very, very careful." Ruth walked back to the main house in a daze, the butter forgotten in her hand, until Dinah scolded her for taking so long. But that night, lying on her mat in the dark, Ruth traced the letter A on the floor with her finger, over and over until she fell asleep. Over the following weeks, Ruth returned to the barn whenever she could slip away unnoticed. Jacob came irregularly, sometimes once a week, sometimes not for 2 weeks, but when he came, he always taught. The group of children grew slowly. Jacob never brought more than 5 or 6 at a time, and he was meticulous about varying the nights and times so that no pattern could be established. Ruth learned the alphabet. She learned how letters combined to make sounds, how sounds formed words. Jacob used dirt, charcoal, and occasionally small pieces of slate he had somehow acquired. He never brought books, too dangerous, but he recited passages from memory and had the children repeat them, connecting spoken words to written letters. For Ruth, it was like discovering a hidden room in a house she thought she knew completely. The world, which had always seemed fixed and immutable, suddenly contained possibilities she hadn't imagined. Words weren't just sounds, they were shapes, patterns, things that could be captured and held. The morning of October 12, 1847, began like any other. Ruth woke before dawn, helped prepare breakfast, and began her daily cleaning routine. By mid-morning, she was in the parlor, Thomas Carver's private study, dusting the bookshelves. The room was filled with morning light streaming through tall windows. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls, their spines embossed with gold lettering. Carver's desk sat in the center of the room, covered with papers, ledgers, and correspondence. Ruth worked methodically, using a soft cloth to wipe each shelf, careful not to disturb the arrangement of books. She had cleaned this room hundreds of times, but today something was different. One of Carver's journals lay open on his desk, and Ruth, thinking herself alone, approached it. She'd been learning for over a year now, and her skills had progressed far beyond the alphabet. She could read simple sentences and, with effort, more complex passages. The journal was filled with Carver's neat handwriting. Ruth leaned over it, her eyes scanning the page. It was an entry about crop yields, notes about which fields had produced the best tobacco, observations about weather patterns. Ruth's lips moved silently as she read. The western field continues to outperform expectations. The soil composition, enriched by last year's fallow period, has proven ideal for... What are you doing? Ruth's blood turned to ice. She spun around to find Elizabeth Carver standing in the doorway, a basket of sewing in her hands. Mrs. Carver's face showed confusion, then dawning horror as she realized what she had just witnessed. "Were you reading that?" Mrs. Carver's voice was barely above a whisper. Ruth opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her mind raced. She could deny it, claim she was just looking at the book, pretend she didn't understand the question. But Mrs. Carver's expression told her it was too late. She had been seen, unmistakably, reading. "Answer me," Mrs. Carver said, her voice rising. "Were you reading my husband's journal?" Ruth's voice was tiny. "Yes, ma'am." The basket fell from Mrs. Carver's hands, spilling thread and fabric across the floor. She stared at Ruth as though she were seeing a ghost, or something worse, something that violated the fundamental order of reality. How is that possible?" Mrs. Carver took a step forward. "Who taught you?" Ruth shook her head, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I can't say, ma'am. Please, I can't say." Mrs. Carver's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and something else that Ruth couldn't identify. She turned and ran from the room, calling for her husband. Within minutes, Thomas Carver appeared, his face dark with anger. He grabbed Ruth by the arm and dragged her into the center of the room. "Demonstrate," he commanded, placing an open book in front of her. "Read this. Now." With a trembling voice, Ruth read the passage aloud. It was from a history book, something about European wars. She stumbled over some of the words, but the meaning was clear enough. She could read. Carver closed the book slowly. His jaw clenched. "Who taught you this?" "I don't know his name," Ruth said, which was a lie, but one she would protect with her life. "Where did you learn?" "I can't tell you. He said if I told anyone, he would leave and I could never learn again." Carver's eyes narrowed. "Is it someone on this plantation?" Ruth shook her head. "I don't know where he comes from. Are there other children who can read?" Ruth hesitated, then nodded slowly. Carver and his wife exchanged a long look. The implications were sinking in. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was systematic. "Get Hackett," Carver said to his wife, "and send someone to round up every child on this property between 6 and 12 years old. Every single one, immediately." The assembly of children took nearly 2 hours. 21 children were gathered in the front yard of the Carver plantation, standing in an uneven line, their faces showing confusion and fear. Most of them had been pulled away from their morning tasks, and they didn't understand what was happening. Hackett, the head overseer, stood to one side with 2 other white workers, watching the group with suspicion. Thomas Carver emerged from the main house, carrying a large slate and a piece of chalk. He had devised a simple test. He would write a sentence on the slate, show it to each child individually, and ask them to read it aloud. Most children, he assumed, would stare at the letters with incomprehension, but he needed to know how many had been contaminated by this secret education. The first child, a boy named Peter, age 10, looked at the slate with genuine confusion. "I don't know what that says, sir," he mumbled. "Look closely," Carver insisted. Peter squinted at the letters. "I can't read, sir." Carver moved to the next child, then the next. 14 children in a row showed no recognition of the written words. They were, as expected, illiterate. But the 15th child, a girl named Hannah, looked at the slate and her eyes widened slightly. She glanced at Ruth, who was standing to the side under guard, then back at the slate. "Well?" Carver demanded. Hannah's voice was barely audible. "It says, 'The sun rises in the east.'" A murmur ran through the assembled adults. Carver's jaw tightened. "And who taught you to read?" Hannah stared at the ground. "The night teacher." "What is the night teacher's name?" "He never told us his name." Carver continued down the line. Out of 21 children, 5 could read fluently, and 2 others recognized some letters but couldn't form complete words. 7 children, in total, had been taught. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Carver household. Thomas Carver immediately dispatched riders to neighboring plantations with instructions to conduct similar tests. Within 3 days, reports began flooding back, and each one deepened the mystery. At the Whitley estate, 6 miles to the west, 5 children could read. At the Brennan plantation, 4 children. At the small Collins farm, 2 children. Across 7 different properties in Cumberland County, a total of 16 children, now including the 7 from the Carver plantation, had been taught to read and write, and every single child, when questioned separately, told the same story. A man came at night. He taught them in secret places, old barns, abandoned mills, clearings in the woods. He used dirt, charcoal, and slate. He was kind and patient. He made them promise never to reveal his identity or tell anyone about the lessons. And he came and went like a shadow, never seen by adults, never leaving evidence behind. The planters were baffled and terrified. How had one man moved so freely between their properties? How had he evaded every patrol, every overseer, every form of surveillance they had in place? And most disturbing of all, how many more children had he taught that they hadn't yet discovered? On October 19, 1847, Thomas Carver convened an emergency meeting of plantation owners at his estate. 11 men gathered in the large dining room, seated around a mahogany table that had been covered with maps, reports, and correspondence. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with cigar smoke and barely suppressed panic. Carver stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on a stack of documents. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are facing an unprecedented threat. Someone has been systematically teaching slave children to read and write across multiple properties in this county. Based on our investigation so far, we've confirmed at least 23 cases, but I believe that number is conservative. There may be many more we haven't discovered yet." James Whitley, a thin man with hawkish features, leaned forward. "My overseer has questioned every adult on my property. No one admits to knowing anything about this." The children all described the same person, a man who comes at night, but none of them can or will provide a name. "Same on my land," said Martin Grayson, a heavy-set man with a red face. "It's like he's a damned ghost. My workers are out in the fields all day, and we have night patrols, but somehow this man has been slipping through for God knows how long." Robert Brennan, the youngest of the group, spoke up. "Could it be someone from outside the county? Someone traveling through?" Carver shook his head. "The children report regular lessons over an extended period. This isn't a one-time incident. This is a sustained campaign of education that's been going on for at least a year, possibly longer. Whoever this person is, they know our properties intimately. They know our routines, our blind spots, our schedules, which suggests," said Samuel Porter slowly, "that it's someone we know, someone who has legitimate reasons to be traveling between plantations." The room fell silent as this implication sank in. "A tradesman," Whitley said. "Someone who repairs equipment, delivers goods, provides services." "Or one of our own people," Grayson added. "Someone we trust enough to let them move around freely." Carver pulled out a map of Cumberland County and spread it across the table. He had marked each plantation where literate children had been found with a red X. "Look at the pattern," he said. "The affected properties form a rough circle, about 15 miles in diameter. In the center of that circle," he tapped a point on the map, "is the old Appomattox Mill Road. It's barely used anymore, but it connects to several of our properties through forest paths." Porter studied the map. "I have a carpenter named Jacob who travels that route regularly. I've given him permission to take on repair work at other plantations to supplement his value. He's been doing it for years." "Jacob," Carver repeated, making a note. "What do you know about him?" "He's in his 40s, highly skilled, reliable. I bought him about 20 years ago from an estate sale in North Carolina. He's never given me any trouble." "Quite the opposite. He's one of my most valuable workers." "Can he read?" Carver asked. Porter paused. I've never tested him. I've never had reason to suspect he could." "Test him," Carver said. "Soon. And in the meantime, I suggest we all compile lists of anyone, slave or free, black or white, who has regular access to multiple properties. Tradesmen, peddlers, preachers, anyone who travels." The men agreed, and the meeting continued for several more hours as they discussed security measures, punishment for the children who had been taught, and strategies for identifying the mysterious teacher. But beneath the practical discussions ran a current of fear. Their entire system of control had been breached, and they didn't know how deep the breach went. Jacob had been a carpenter on the Porter plantation for over 20 years, but his story began long before that, in a different life that he rarely allowed himself to remember in detail. He had been born in Maryland in 1805, on a small farm owned by a Quaker family named Hadley. William Hadley, the patriarch, believed slavery was a moral evil, but had inherited enslaved people when his father died. Rather than sell them, which he considered an even greater evil, he had kept them but treated them as something closer to indentured servants. Hadley paid them small wages, allowed them to keep gardens and sell their produce, and most controversially, taught them to read and write. Jacob had learned to read by age 8. Hadley's wife, Mary, had taught him using the same primers she used with her own children. By age 12, Jacob could read fluently and write clearly. He had read the Bible cover to cover twice, and he had been exposed to newspapers, agricultural journals, and even some philosophy. He understood that his literacy was unusual, even dangerous, but within the sheltered environment of the Hadley farm, it had seemed natural. When William Hadley died unexpectedly in 1827, everything changed. Hadley's adult son, who had moved to Philadelphia and embraced different views, returned to settle the estate. He had debts, and the quickest way to pay them was to sell the farm and everyone on it. Jacob, 22 years old and valuable because of his carpentry skills, was sold to a trader who took him south. The next few years were a blur of different owners and different locations. Jacob quickly learned to hide his literacy. He watched men and women beaten for smaller infractions than being able to read, and he understood that his knowledge was a death sentence if discovered. He became adept at appearing ignorant, at moving through spaces without being noticed, at giving people what they expected to see. In 1830, he was purchased by Samuel Porter and brought to Cumberland County. Porter needed skilled workers for his growing operation, and Jacob's carpentry abilities made him immediately valuable. Porter allowed Jacob unusual freedom of movement, trusting him to travel to other plantations to perform repairs and generate additional income. For 15 years, Jacob used this freedom to survive and eventually to thrive in his own quiet way. He built furniture, repaired structures, and earned a reputation as one of the best carpenters in the county. He was respectful, reliable, and invisible, exactly what a white owner wanted from an enslaved craftsman. But the knowledge he carried haunted him. He saw children growing up in the same ignorance he had been rescued from, and the weight of his silence became unbearable. He told himself for years that he couldn't risk it, that teaching would put everyone in danger, that his obligation was to survive. But in the spring of 1845, something changed. He had been repairing a fence at the Whitley plantation when he overheard a conversation between two of the enslaved men working nearby. They were discussing a child who had been sold away from his mother, separated because the owner needed cash. One of the men said, "He's better off not knowing any different. What you don't know can't hurt you." That phrase, "what you don't know can't hurt you," lodged in Jacob's mind like a splinter. He thought about it all day, all week, and he realized that it was a lie, perhaps the most fundamental lie of the entire system. What you don't know could absolutely hurt you. Ignorance was a weapon used against people, not a shield that protected them. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would teach. Jacob started small and moved with extreme caution. His first student was Hannah, the daughter of a woman named Martha, who worked in the Whitley kitchen. Jacob had watched Hannah for weeks, noting her intelligence, her curiosity, the way she studied things carefully before acting. One evening, while making repairs to the Whitley barn, he had approached her. "Can you keep a secret?" he asked quietly. Hannah, 7 years old, had looked at him with serious eyes. "Yes, I mean a very important secret, the kind where if you tell anyone, something bad would happen." She nodded. "I can teach you to read," Jacob said, "but only if you promise never to tell anyone. Not your mother, not your friends, not anyone." Hannah's eyes widened. "Why would you do that?" "Because you should know," Jacob said simply. "Because everyone should know." They met 3 nights later, in the old Whitley tobacco barn, the one that hadn't been used for storage in years. Jacob brought charcoal and used the wooden floor as a slate. He taught Hannah the alphabet, starting with the letter that began her name. She was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge, and careful to follow his instructions about secrecy. After 4 lessons, Jacob felt confident enough to bring in 2 more children, boys named Peter and David, from the neighboring Grayson plantation. The lessons followed a pattern. Jacob would arrive just after full dark, when most people were exhausted from the day's work and unlikely to be moving around. He would teach for no more than an hour, using materials that left no trace. Dirt, charcoal, his memory. He taught the alphabet first, then simple words, then basic sentences. He never brought books, never wrote anything that could be discovered later. Everything existed only in the moment and in the memories of his students. He was meticulous about varying his routine. He never came on the same night of the week. He never taught in the same location twice in a row. He never took the same path between properties. He learned to move through the woods at night with an almost supernatural silence, and he developed an instinct for when it was safe to be somewhere and when he needed to disappear. Over the course of the first year, he taught 11 children. By the second year, that number had grown to 42. He organized them into small groups, never more than 6 at a time, and he kept the groups separate so that if one was discovered, the others might remain safe. The children, for their part, were remarkably good at keeping the secret. They understood, even at young ages, that what they were learning was dangerous. They also understood that it was precious. Jacob instilled in them a sense of responsibility, not just for protecting themselves, but for protecting each other and protecting him. Some of the children progressed faster than others. Ruth, from the Carver plantation, whom Jacob had encountered by accident that night at the old barn, turned out to be one of his most talented students. She absorbed everything he taught with an intensity that both impressed and worried him. He could see that she was beginning to see the world differently, to ask questions that had no safe answers. One night, about 6 months into her education, Ruth had asked him, "Why don't they want us to read?" Jacob had considered how to answer. "Because reading gives you power. It lets you understand things they don't want you to understand. It lets you imagine things they don't want you to imagine." Like what? Like the idea that you could be something other than what they tell you you are. Ruth had gone quiet, processing this. Then she asked, "Are you scared?" "Every day," Jacob admitted. "But I'm more scared of not doing this than I am of getting caught." It was the most honest he had ever been with any of his students, and it marked a turning point in their relationship. Ruth wasn't just learning to read, she was beginning to understand the deeper implications of what Jacob was risking, and why. By the autumn of 1847, Jacob was teaching over 60 children across 9 different plantations. The operation had grown far beyond what he had originally envisioned, and with that growth came increased risk. It was becoming harder to keep track of all his students, harder to maintain the strict security protocols, harder to avoid detection. He had developed a system of signals to communicate with the children. A mark on a tree meant a lesson would happen that night. A different mark meant to stay away because it wasn't safe. The children learned to read these signals as carefully as they learned to read letters. But Jacob knew the system was fragile. All it would take was one child speaking carelessly, one adult noticing something unusual, one lucky patrol catching him in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had close calls, moments when he had to freeze in the shadows while overseers passed within feet of him, nights when he arrived at a meeting spot to find it unexpectedly occupied and had to abort the lesson. He began to prepare for the inevitable discovery. He started teaching the children not just to read, but to teach others. He explained to his most advanced students how to form letters, how to sound out words, how to be patient with learners. He told them that if anything happened to him, they should continue carefully in secret, passing the knowledge along. Some of his students took this instruction to heart more than others. Hannah, his first student, had begun teaching her younger brother. Samuel, a boy from the Brennan plantation, had taught two of his cousins. The knowledge was spreading beyond Jacob's direct control, which both pleased and terrified him. In September of 1847, Jacob made a decision that would prove fateful. There was a group of children on the Carver plantation that he hadn't yet reached, and Ruth had asked him repeatedly to teach them. Jacob was hesitant. The Carver plantation was one of the most strictly controlled in the county, and Thomas Carver himself was known for his meticulous attention to detail. But Ruth was persuasive, and Jacob felt a sense of obligation to reach as many children as possible. He agreed to teach at the old tobacco barn on the Carver property, using Ruth as a liaison to gather students. It was a risk, but it seemed manageable. What Jacob didn't know was that the security at the Carver plantation had recently been tightened. Thomas Carver, concerned about reports of theft at neighboring estates, had implemented irregular night patrols and had instructed his overseer Hackett to note any unusual activity. The plantation that had seemed like a calculated risk was actually a trap waiting to spring. The morning Ruth was discovered reading Thomas Carver's journal marked the beginning of the end, though it would take weeks for the full consequences to unfold. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and terrifying. After the assembly of children and the shocking revelation that 7 of them could read, Thomas Carver locked Ruth in a small storage room while he decided what to do. Ruth spent hours in the dark, listening to muffled voices arguing outside, imagining the worst. She was terrified not for herself, but for Jacob. She had made the mistake that would expose him. She had been careless, confident, too pleased with her own abilities to maintain proper caution. When the door finally opened, it was Dinah, the head housekeeper, who entered. Dinah's face was unreadable as she set down a plate of food and a cup of water. "Eat," Dinah said. Ruth stared at the food. "What's going to happen to me?" Dinah sighed. "I don't know, child. But Mr. Carver is sending people to all the nearby plantations. They're testing other children, seeing how far this goes. You've stirred up a hornet's nest." "I didn't mean to," Ruth whispered. "I know. But intention doesn't matter now." Dinah paused at the door. "Ruth, whoever taught you, you need to protect them. No matter what they threaten you with, you can't reveal who it was. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, tears streaming down her face. Over the following days, as the scope of the secret education network became clear, the plantation owners of Cumberland County moved into action. The initial shock gave way to organized investigation. They compiled lists of everyone who moved between properties. They interrogated adults. They imposed strict new controls on the movements of enslaved people. And they established a reward, $200, for information leading to the identity of the teacher. $200 was an enormous sum, more than many enslaved people could imagine. The planters believed that someone would break, that the promise of money or freedom would crack the wall of silence. But weeks passed, and no one came forward. The children were questioned repeatedly, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, but they held firm. They didn't know his name, they said. They didn't know where he came from. He was just the night teacher, and he disappeared like smoke. The investigation began to focus on men who traveled between plantations for legitimate reasons. Peddlers were questioned. Itinerant preachers were interrogated. And eventually, attention turned to the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the wheelwrights, the carpenters who moved from property to property, offering their services. Samuel Porter had always considered himself a shrewd judge of character. He prided himself on his ability to manage his property efficiently while maintaining what he believed was a humane approach. He didn't use physical punishment as liberally as some of his neighbors, and he rewarded good work with small privileges. Jacob had been one of his success stories, a skilled worker who generated income and reflected well on Porter's management skills. But now, sitting in his office and considering the possibility that Jacob might be the mysterious teacher, Porter felt a mixture of doubt curiosity, and betrayal. If Jacob had been deceiving him for years, what did that say about Porter's judgment? He decided to test Jacob subtly, without revealing his suspicions. On the morning of October 23rd, Porter called Jacob to his office. "Jacob, I have a task for you," Porter said, gesturing to a piece of paper on his desk. "I need you to deliver a message to Thomas Carver tomorrow. Before you go, I want to make sure you understand what it says, so you can answer any questions he might have." Porter pushed the paper across the desk. It contained a simple message, confirming delivery of tobacco samples for quality assessment. Please review and respond by return messenger. Jacob picked up the paper and looked at it for several long seconds. Porter watched his eyes carefully, looking for any sign that he was reading. "I can't read, sir," Jacob said finally, setting the paper down. "But if you tell me what it says, I can remember it and repeat it to Mr. Carver." "Are you certain you can't read?" Porter pressed. "Not even a little." Jacob met his eyes with an expression of mild confusion. "No, sir, I never learned." Porter held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. The message says—" He proceeded to explain the content, and Jacob listened attentively, repeating it back perfectly. But Porter wasn't satisfied. He sent word to Thomas Carver about his suspicions, and together they devised a more elaborate test. They would follow Jacob on his next trip. On the night of November 8, 1847, Jacob left the Porter plantation just after sunset, carrying his leather tool bag and a small lantern. He had told the overseer he was going to repair a broken wagon wheel at the Brennan estate, a job that would take several hours. The overseer had nodded and waved him on without suspicion. What Jacob didn't know was that 3 men were following him at a careful distance. Thomas Carver had organized the surveillance personally. He had chosen Hackett, his own overseer, along with 2 experienced hunters who knew the county's forests intimately. The men were armed and had instructions to observe, but not to intervene until they had concrete evidence. Jacob walked along the main road for the first mile, his pace steady and unhurried. The evening was cool, the sky clear, and a thin crescent moon provided just enough light to make the road visible. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a carpenter heading to a job. But when he reached the fork in the road where one branch led to the Brennan plantation, Jacob didn't take it. Instead, he continued straight, toward a less traveled path that led deeper into the woods. The men following him exchanged glances. This was already suspicious. Hackett gestured for silence, and they continued tracking Jacob through the forest. Jacob walked for another 30 minutes, occasionally pausing to listen, once stopping completely for several minutes as though sensing something. The trackers froze each time, barely breathing. Finally, Jacob seemed satisfied and continued on. He emerged into a small clearing near an old mill that had been abandoned for over a decade. The structure was partially collapsed, its water wheel frozen and overgrown with vines. Jacob circled around to the back of the mill and entered through a gap in the wall. The men tracking him crept closer, positioning themselves where they could see without being seen. They waited. 10 minutes passed. Then, from various directions, small figures began to appear. Children, moving silently through the darkness toward the mill. The trackers counted 6 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 12. The children entered the mill through the same gap Jacob had used. Hackett leaned close to one of the other men and whispered, "We've got him." Inside the mill, Jacob had set up his makeshift classroom. He had cleared a space on the floor and had several pieces of slate that he had hidden there. He used charcoal to write on the slates, teaching the children new words and reviewing old lessons. His voice was low and patient. "This word is freedom," he said, writing it carefully. "It's an important word. Do you know what it means?" One of the children, a boy named Thomas, raised his hand. "It means not being owned by anyone." "That's right," Jacob said. "Now let's break it down into sounds." The lesson continued for nearly 45 minutes. Jacob worked with each child individually, checking their progress, correcting mistakes, offering encouragement. The atmosphere was focused and quiet, with none of the restlessness you might expect from young children. They understood the privilege and the danger of what they were doing. When the lesson ended, Jacob carefully erased the slates and hid them in a hollow in the mill wall. He sent the children home one at a time, spaced a few minutes apart, instructing them to take different routes. "Remember," he told them, "tell no one, and be careful." The children disappeared into the night. Jacob waited until they were gone, then gathered his things and prepared to leave. He never made it out of the clearing. As he emerged from the mill, Hackett and the two trackers stepped out from the tree line, blocking his path. Hackett held a lantern high, illuminating Jacob's face. "Jacob," Hackett said, his voice calm but cold, "you've been a very busy man." Jacob froze, his hand tightening on his tool bag. For a moment, the night was silent except for the sound of wind in the trees. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities, running, fighting, denying, but he knew it was over. They had seen everything. "Mr. Carver wants to speak with you," Hackett continued. "You're going to come with us. Now." Jacob looked at the three men, at the darkness of the forest behind them, at the road that led back to a life that was now irreversibly changed. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll come." They bound his hands and led him through the forest toward the Carver plantation. Jacob walked in silence, his mind already working through the implications. He had been caught, but the children hadn't. If he could protect their identities, if he could keep them safe, perhaps something of his work would survive. Jacob was held in a locked storage shed on the Carver plantation, while Thomas Carver sent urgent messages to every plantation owner within 20 miles. By the afternoon of November 9th, over 30 men had gathered in Carver's largest barn, which had been cleared and furnished with benches for the occasion. Jacob could hear the murmur of voices from his prison, the sound of horses arriving, the growing crowd of angry men who had come to decide his fate. He sat on the dirt floor, his back against the wall, and waited. Inside the barn, Thomas Carver stood on a raised platform, addressing the assembled planters. The atmosphere was charged with anger and fear. "Gentlemen," Carver began, "we have apprehended the individual responsible for the systematic education of slave children across 7 counties. His name is Jacob, property of Samuel Porter, and he has confessed to teaching literacy skills to over 60 children over a period of approximately 2 years. A roar of angry voices filled the barn. Men stood, shouting questions and demands. "Hang him! Make an example! How do we know he worked alone?" Carver raised his hands for silence. "We have interrogated him extensively. He claims to have worked alone, and I believe him. His method was simple but effective. He used his legitimate carpentry work as cover to travel between properties, and he conducted lessons in abandoned or isolated locations at night. He was careful, methodical, and patient." "How did we not see this?" someone shouted from the back. Carver's jaw tightened. "Because he understood our systems better than we understood them ourselves. He knew our routines, our blind spots, our assumptions. He exploited the very freedom of movement we granted him because he was valuable and trusted." Samuel Porter stood, his face flushed. "I take responsibility for failing to detect this. Jacob has been my property for 20 years and I never suspected. I will bear any costs associated with this incident." "The cost," said Martin Grayson, "is not just financial. The cost is that we now have 60 educated slave children who represent a permanent threat to stability. They can read, they can write, they can communicate in ways we can't monitor. And worse, we don't know if they'll teach others." This observation sent a new wave of concern through the assembly. Men who had been focused on punishing Jacob now began to realize the broader implications. "What do we do about the children?" asked Robert Brennan. Carver had prepared for this question. "We've compiled a complete list of all children Jacob taught. I propose that we separate them. Sell them to different regions, preferably far south, where their skills will be less useful and where they'll have no connection to each other or to anyone who might encourage further education." "That's over 60 sales," Porter said. "The economic impact alone." "The alternative," Carver interrupted, is to keep them here, where they represent an ongoing risk, and where they might continue to spread literacy. Gentlemen, we're not just dealing with the children Jacob taught directly. We're dealing with the possibility that those children will teach others, who will teach others. This is a contagion, and it must be contained. The room fell silent as the men absorbed the scope of the problem. Finally, James Whitley spoke up. And what about Jacob himself? All eyes turned to Samuel Porter, who stood and addressed the assembly. I have given this considerable thought. Executing him would make him a martyr and would draw unwanted attention from abolitionists in the North. They would use his story to attack our entire way of life. I propose instead that we sell him as far south as possible, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the work is hard and the life expectancy is short. He will disappear, and his story will die with him. I agree, Carver said. We should handle this quietly. No public trial, no spectacle, no records that might be discovered later and used against us. Jacob simply disappears, the children are separated and sold, and we implement new security measures to ensure this never happens again. The vote was nearly unanimous. Jacob would be sold to a slave trader heading to Louisiana within the week. The children would be separated and sold over the following months, and the entire incident would be documented as vaguely as possible in official records to avoid creating evidence that could be used by anti-slavery advocates. On the evening before Jacob was to be taken away, Thomas Carver made a decision that surprised even himself. He wanted to understand. Despite his anger, despite the threat Jacob had represented, Carver felt compelled to speak with the man who had outsmarted him and dozens of other educated, powerful men for over 2 years. Carver entered the shed where Jacob was being held. Jacob sat against the wall, his hands still bound, his face showing exhaustion and resignation. Carver carried a lantern and a flask of water, which he offered to Jacob. "Thank you," Jacob said, drinking deeply. Carver sat down on a wooden crate across from him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Carver broke the silence. "I need to understand something, Jacob. You had a good position. You were skilled, valued, trusted. You had freedoms that most men in your position never receive. Why would you risk all of that? What could you possibly hope to accomplish?" Jacob looked at him steadily. "I hope to give those children something that couldn't be taken away from them. Knowledge, understanding, the ability to see the world as it truly is, not as you tell them it is. But you must have known you would be caught eventually," Carver pressed. "You must have known the consequences." "I knew," Jacob said simply, "but I also knew that if I didn't act, I would be complicit in keeping those children in darkness. I had been given something precious, education, and I couldn't justify keeping it to myself while others suffered for lack of it." Carver shook his head. "You've endangered them, Jacob. Don't you see that? By teaching them to read, you've made them unfit for their lives. You've given them aspirations they can never fulfill. You've created discontent where there should have been acceptance. That's not mercy. That's cruelty." For the first time, anger flashed in Jacob's eyes. The cruelty is in the system that makes education dangerous. The cruelty is in telling human beings that they're not entitled to use their minds. The cruelty is yours, Mr. Carver, not mine. Carver stood abruptly. "You're wrong. The world has a natural order, and that order exists for good reasons. When people accept their place in that order, everyone is better off. What you've done is sow chaos." "No," Jacob said quietly. "What I've done is plant seeds. And you can sell me. And you can sell those children, and you can try to erase every trace of what happened here. But those seeds will grow. Maybe not today, maybe not for years, but they will grow." Carver stared at him, disturbed by the certainty in Jacob's voice. "You're deluded if you think your actions will change anything." Jacob smiled faintly. "Time will tell, Mr. Carver." Carver left the shed without another word, but the conversation haunted him. There had been something in Jacob's expression, not defiance exactly, but a kind of patient confidence that unsettled him deeply. The weeks following Jacob's capture were chaotic across Cumberland County. The plantation owners moved quickly to implement their plan, but the execution proved more complicated than anticipated. The first problem was identifying all the children Jacob had taught. The initial count of 63 turned out to be conservative. As more thorough testing was conducted, the number climbed to 78, then to 91. Some children had learned only the basics and had kept it secret so successfully that even their parents didn't know. Others had taught siblings or friends, expanding the network beyond Jacob's direct reach. The second problem was the reaction of the enslaved community itself. Word of Jacob's capture spread quickly, and with it came a mixture of grief, anger, and fear. People who had never met Jacob mourned him as a hero. Parents whose children had been taught felt torn between pride in their children's accomplishments and terror for their safety. Some of the children who had been identified tried to protect others by refusing to reveal the full extent of the network. Ruth, despite facing significant pressure, never revealed the names of other students she knew about. Hannah did the same. This protective instinct, this loyalty to the community Jacob had created, made the planters' job of containment much more difficult. The third problem was the economic and logistical challenge of selling over 90 children. The local slave market couldn't absorb that many young workers at once without arousing suspicion and driving down prices. The sales had to be spread out over months, sent to different regions, carefully managed to avoid drawing attention. Thomas Carver personally oversaw the sale of the 7 children from his plantation. Ruth was sold to a family in Georgia in December 1847. She was 9 years old, and she carried with her the knowledge Jacob had given her, hidden but intact. Carver received a fair price for her, and he told himself he was being reasonable, even merciful. She could have been punished far more harshly. But at night, alone in his library, Carver found himself troubled by thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. He had won. Jacob was gone. The children were being dispersed, and new security measures were in place. Yet he felt as though he had lost something, or perhaps that something had been revealed that he wished had stayed hidden. He began documenting the incident in his personal journal, writing detailed accounts of the investigation and capture. But he found himself unable to characterize Jacob in simple terms. Criminal felt insufficient. Insurgent was too dramatic. He settled on educator, then crossed it out and wrote agitator, then crossed that out too. Finally, he left the space blank, unable to find a word that captured what Jacob had been. Jacob was sold to a slave trader named Dixon on November 15, 1847. Dixon specialized in transporting enslaved people from Virginia to the Deep South, where demand for labor in the expanding cotton and sugar industries was high. Jacob was chained alongside 14 other men and 3 women in the back of a wagon that would take them first to Richmond, then by boat down the coast to New Orleans. The journey took 3 weeks. Jacob spent most of it in silence, watching the landscape change as they moved south. He thought about the children he had taught, wondering what would become of them, hoping that they would remember what he had shown them. In New Orleans, Jacob was sold at auction to a representative of a sugar plantation in Louisiana's river parishes. The plantation was one of the largest and most profitable in the state, and it was also one of the most brutal. Workers toiled 16-hour days during the grinding season, and the death rate was high. Jacob was assigned to work in the fields initially, despite his carpentry skills, as a form of punishment for his perceived transgression. The overseer had been briefed about his history and made it clear that Jacob would not be given any opportunities to spread his knowledge. But the planter who had purchased him, a man named Richard Beaumont, eventually recognized Jacob's value as a carpenter and moved him to maintenance work. Jacob spent the remaining years of his life repairing equipment, building structures, and keeping his literacy secret. He never taught again. The surveillance was too tight, the consequences too severe, and his spirit, while not broken, was worn down by the weight of what he had lost. He died in 1852, 5 years after leaving Virginia, during an outbreak of cholera that swept through the plantation. He was buried in an unmarked grave alongside dozens of other workers who died that season. No record was made of his life, his skills, or his accomplishments. In the official documents of the Beaumont plantation, he appeared only as Jacob Carpenter, acquired 1847, deceased 1852. The man who had taught over 100 children to read had become a footnote, a line in a ledger, a number. The children Jacob taught were scattered across the South. Their stories diverged in countless directions, and most of those stories have been lost to history. But fragments remain, hints of how Jacob's legacy persisted despite every effort to erase it. Ruth, sold to a family in Georgia, worked as a house servant for the next 16 years. She never forgot how to read, though she rarely had opportunity to practice. When the Civil War ended and she gained her freedom, she was 27 years old. She made her way to Atlanta, where she found work and eventually enrolled in one of the schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau. She became a teacher herself, instructing former slaves in basic literacy. One of her students later wrote about her, "Miss Ruth was different from other teachers. She understood what it meant to learn in secret, to protect knowledge like a treasure. She never took education for granted, and she never let us take it for granted either." Ruth died in 1889, having taught hundreds of students over her lifetime. She never spoke publicly about Jacob. The habit of secrecy was too deeply ingrained. But she kept a small piece of charcoal in her possession until the end of her life, a memento of her first lessons in that abandoned barn. Hannah, Jacob's first student, was sold to a plantation in Alabama. She was 11 when she arrived, and she spent the next decade working in the fields. But she taught her younger brother to read, using the same methods Jacob had used with her: dirt, charcoal, stolen moments of privacy. Her brother, in turn, taught others. By the time the Civil War disrupted the plantation system, a small network of literate enslaved people existed on that Alabama property, all descended from the knowledge Hannah had brought with her. Samuel, the boy from the Brennan plantation who had shown such aptitude, was sold to a family in South Carolina. He lost his literacy skills over the years. Without practice or reinforcement, the knowledge faded. But when Reconstruction brought schools to his area, he relearned quickly, his brain remembering patterns it had absorbed as a child. He became a lay preacher and taught himself to read the Bible fluently. He died in 1901, a respected elder in his community. Not all the stories ended well. Some of the children Jacob taught were sold to particularly harsh situations where any display of literacy would have been punished severely. Some died young, their potential unrealized. Some simply disappeared into the vast, poorly documented history of enslaved people in the American South. But collectively, they represented something that the plantation owners of Cumberland County had feared and could not fully comprehend: the impossibility of containing knowledge once it was released. Each child Jacob taught carried seeds of understanding that could not be fully suppressed. Some of those seeds lay dormant for years. Others found purchase in unlikely soil and grew in unexpected directions. In the years following Jacob's capture, the planters of Cumberland County implemented extensive new security measures. They restricted travel between plantations. They conducted random literacy tests. They demolished or secured abandoned structures that could serve as secret meeting places. They established informant networks and offered rewards for information about unauthorized education. But they also began to realize the fundamental problem with their campaign: you cannot unknow something. The children who had learned to read didn't forget, even when they pretended to. The knowledge existed in their minds, inaccessible to surveillance, impossible to confiscate. Thomas Carver, in his meticulous journals, documented his growing frustration with this reality. In an entry from March 1848, he wrote, "We have taken every reasonable precaution, yet I remain troubled by the knowledge that approximately 90 individuals on properties within this county possess skills that could undermine stability. We cannot monitor their thoughts, cannot erase their memories. We have closed the source of the contamination, but the contamination itself persists. This troubles me greatly. By 1850, most of the children Jacob had taught had been sold and dispersed, but new concerns emerged. Rumors circulated of other night teachers in adjacent counties. Some of these rumors were founded on actual cases, copycat educators inspired by stories of Jacob's campaign. Others were simply paranoia, the planter class seeing shadows everywhere. The fear of literacy became almost obsessive in some quarters. Laws that had existed on the books but were rarely enforced began to be applied more rigorously. White teachers who expressed sympathy for abolition found themselves under suspicion. Free black people who demonstrated education were viewed with hostility and suspicion. But the system was inherently leaky. Knowledge moved through informal channels that no amount of legislation or surveillance could fully close. Literate enslaved people taught family members in whispers, in brief moments of privacy. Free black people shared information in churches and social gatherings. And as the 1850s progressed and tensions over slavery intensified nationally, the flow of forbidden knowledge increased rather than decreased. When the Civil War began in 1861, the world that Jacob had navigated so carefully began to collapse. The plantation system, which had seemed immutable and eternal to those who benefited from it, revealed itself to be fragile and dependent on conditions that could change. Cumberland County itself became a battleground. Union and Confederate forces moved through the area repeatedly, and the plantations that had been centers of wealth and control became targets for destruction. Fields were burned, buildings were commandeered, and the enslaved population faced new opportunities and dangers. Many of the children Jacob had taught were adults by this time, in their 20s or 30s. Some of them escaped to Union lines, where their literacy skills made them valuable as scouts, translators, and administrators. Others remained on the plantations, navigating the chaos as best they could. The Carver plantation, Thomas Carver's carefully managed domain, was occupied by Union forces in 1864. Carver himself had died 2 years earlier, and his widow Elizabeth struggled to maintain the property in the face of wartime disruption. The enslaved workers, sensing the changing times, began to assert themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. When Union officers arrived to assess the plantation's resources, they were surprised to find several of the workers could read and write. One officer noted in his report, contrary to expectations, found multiple literate Negroes on the Carver property. They claim to have been taught years ago by a traveling educator, though details are vague. These individuals have proven valuable in organizing work details and maintaining records. The officer had no way of knowing that he was observing the distant ripples of Jacob's work, knowledge that had survived years of suppression and had now found suddenly useful in a changed world. The records discovered in Richmond in 1932 were part of a larger collection of county documents that had been moved from Cumberland County to the state capital during Reconstruction and never properly organized. A clerk conducting an inventory during courthouse renovations found a series of leather-bound ledgers marked Confidential County Business, 1847-1851. The ledgers contained detailed reports of the investigation into Jacob's teaching network. There were lists of children tested for literacy, maps showing affected plantations, correspondence between plantation owners, and extensive documentation of security measures implemented in response to the crisis. What made these documents particularly interesting to historians was how thoroughly they contradicted the public narrative of the antebellum South. The plantation owners had portrayed themselves as benevolent masters, presiding over a contented and ignorant workforce. These documents revealed men who lived in constant fear of their own workers, who saw threats in every shadow, who understood that their system of control was far more fragile than they admitted publicly. The historian who first examined the documents in detail, a man named Dr. Robert Patterson, was struck by the tone of the correspondence. "These are not confident men," he wrote in his preliminary notes. "These are frightened men, engaged in a desperate effort to contain something they don't fully understand. The figure of Jacob haunts these pages not as a criminal, but as something more disturbing, a mirror reflecting their own failures of imagination." Patterson spent several weeks analyzing the documents, cross-referencing names and dates with other historical records. He discovered that many of the children mentioned in the reports had gone on to notable lives after emancipation. At least 7 had become teachers. 3 had been elected to local offices during Reconstruction. 1 had published a memoir that made no mention of her childhood education, maintaining the secrecy even decades later. But Patterson's research was interrupted by pressure from local historical societies and descendants of the plantation families mentioned in the documents. They argued that the records were inflammatory, that they presented a distorted view of history, that they would be misused by those with political agendas. The state archive director, facing mounting pressure, decided to reseal the documents and restrict access. Patterson protested vigorously, but he was overruled. In his final report, he wrote, "The story contained in these documents deserves to be told, not because it flatters anyone, but because it reveals the truth about a system built on the impossible task of keeping human beings ignorant." Jacob succeeded, not because he was exceptional, but because the plantation owner's greatest fear, that enslaved people were fully human, fully capable of learning, was absolutely true. They spent enormous energy denying this reality, and the evidence of their denial is now being suppressed again, this time in the name of historical sensitivity. The documents were resealed in 1933, marked administratively insignificant, and filed in a restricted section of the state archives. They remained there, largely forgotten, for decades. While the official records were suppressed, the story of Jacob persisted in oral tradition within African American communities, though in fragmentary and often altered forms. Descendants of the people Jacob taught sometimes heard family stories about a mysterious teacher who appeared in the night, though details were vague and often mixed with other narratives. In a 1937 interview conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project, an elderly woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been enslaved in Cumberland County, told an interviewer, "My grandmother used to tell me about the night school. Said there was a man who came around teaching children their letters, had to be secret because it was forbidden. She never said his name, but she said he was like a ghost, could move through the dark without making a sound. My grandmother learned from him, and she taught my mother, and my mother taught me. All secret, all passed down, quiet-like." The interviewer pressed for more details, but Sarah had none to offer. The specifics had been lost over 3 generations of retelling. The man had become a legend, a symbol, his actual identity obscured by time and the necessity of secrecy. Similar stories appeared in interviews conducted across Virginia and other southern states. Historians noted the pattern, but generally dismissed these accounts as folklore, exaggerated tales that mixed facts with wishful thinking. The academic consensus was that while there may have been isolated cases of enslaved people learning to read, the idea of organized secret schools was largely mythical. But the people who told these stories believed them. For them, the night teacher, whether he was one person or many, whether his story was accurate in every detail or embellished through retelling, represented a fundamental truth: that the hunger for knowledge had been powerful enough to overcome terrible risks, and that people had been willing to teach and learn even when it could cost them everything. In 1968, during the Civil Rights Movement, a group of historians led by Dr. Julia Morrison began pressing for the reopening of the 1847-1851 documents from Cumberland County. They argued that these records contained important evidence of resistance to slavery and should be made available for research and teaching. The Virginia State Archives initially resisted, citing the same concerns that had led to the documents being sealed in the first place. But under sustained pressure, and in the context of a broader reevaluation of Southern history taking place across the region, the archives agreed to review the restriction. A committee was formed to examine the documents and determine whether they should be made publicly accessible. The committee spent several months analyzing the materials, and their report, issued in 1969, concluded, These documents represent an important historical record of both the sophistication of resistance to slavery and the depth of fear that resistance generated among slaveholders. They should be made available for scholarly research, with appropriate contextual materials to ensure they are properly understood. The documents were officially unsealed in 1970, and researchers finally had access to the full story of Jacob's teaching network. Over the following years, several academic papers and a small number of books explored the case in detail. But even with the documents available, many questions remained unanswered. Jacob's life before he arrived in Cumberland County was largely undocumented. His fate after being sold to Louisiana was uncertain. While records showed he died in 1852, the circumstances were unclear, and most poignantly, the full extent of his teaching network would never be known. The documents listed 91 children by name, but interviews with descendants and analysis of family histories suggested the actual number might have been significantly higher. The story of Jacob and the children he taught is remarkable, not because it was unique, but because it was documented. Throughout the period of American slavery, countless individuals engaged in acts of quiet resistance, teaching, learning, preserving knowledge against all odds. Most of these stories were never recorded, never preserved, never entered into official history. Jacob succeeded because he understood the system he was working against. He knew its rhythms, its blind spots, its assumptions. He used the tools he was given, the freedom of movement granted to a trusted craftsman, and turned them toward a purpose their grantors never imagined. He was patient, careful, and willing to accept enormous risk for incremental progress. The children he taught understood something equally important, that knowledge once gained could not be fully taken away. They protected Jacob's identity even under pressure. They preserved what they had learned even when they couldn't practice it openly, and many of them, when opportunity came, used that knowledge to build new lives and educate others. The plantation owners of Cumberland County believed they could contain the threat through surveillance, suppression, and dispersal. They were partially successful. They did stop Jacob, they did separate the children, they did implement new controls. But they couldn't erase what had already been learned, and they couldn't prevent the knowledge from spreading through channels they didn't anticipate. Thomas Carver, in one of his final journal entries before his death in 1862, wrote something that suggests he understood this on some level. I have come to believe that our great error was in thinking we could maintain absolute ignorance. The human mind seeks knowledge as naturally as a plant seeks light, and perhaps our efforts to prevent this were always doomed to fail. I do not know what the future holds, but I fear that the seeds planted by men like Jacob will bear fruit we cannot imagine. He was right. The seeds Jacob planted did bear fruit, not immediately, not in ways that could be directly traced, but persistently, quietly, in the gradual accumulation of knowledge across generations. When freedom finally came, the formerly enslaved people who learned fastest were often those who had some prior exposure to literacy, even if that exposure had been brief and years earlier. This mystery shows us that some acts of courage are too dangerous to be remembered in their own time, but too important to be forgotten forever. Jacob's story was suppressed for over a century, hidden in sealed documents, reduced to whispers and fragments in family stories. The children he taught were scattered and often silenced. The plantation owners who documented the case did so precisely because they wanted to prevent it from being repeated. But the story survived. It survived in court records and ledgers. It survived in oral traditions and family histories. It survived because the fundamental truth at its core, that people will seek knowledge and freedom even at tremendous risk, is one that cannot be permanently buried. What happened in Cumberland County between 1845 and 1851 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of resistance, education, and quiet defiance that existed throughout the slaveholding South. Jacob was one teacher among many, known because he happened to be documented. How many others were there, moving through the shadows, teaching in whispers, planting seeds that would grow in ways they would never see? We don't know. We can't know. But we know this. When the system of slavery finally collapsed, Thousands of formerly enslaved people demonstrated that they were fully capable of learning, thinking, and building new lives. Many of them had been preparing for that moment in secret, accumulating knowledge in fragments waiting for their chance. Jacob died in obscurity in 1852, forgotten by most, his name erased from official records. But the children he taught, and the people they taught, and the people those people taught, carried forward the simple but revolutionary idea that all people have the right to understand their world through the written word. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? The documents exist, sealed and unsealed across decades. The names of children can be traced through census records and family trees. The plantation ledgers survive in archives. But the full truth of Jacob's motivations, his inner life, his hopes and fears, those are lost to history, knowable only through the actions he took and the legacy he left. Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.